Hey guys, my name is Joseph with FlexLessons.com, and today I am here to talk to you about sight reading at the piano. And in particular, I am here to talk to those of you who shudder when you hear the word sight reading. So what is sight reading exactly? A lot of people don't really understand what this is. So I'm going to try to explain it based on my experience. Sight reading is your ability to parse information using written music on first pass, okay? Some folks will refer to this as your fluid reading ability, and I actually like this term because it's sort of like you're live streaming from the page. You're interpreting things in real time with no preparation or anything other than you literally reading it, okay? That's sight reading. And the second you start repeating the material that you are looking at, it's not sight reading anymore. It's more like study reading because you're starting to make associations, you're starting to memorize a little bit, pretty much the second that you start repeating the information, okay? And so when you have the benefit of studying and repeating things, you can handle a lot more difficult music. And so because of this, it's totally normal for your sight reading ability or your fluid reading ability to lag behind your actual maximum playing ability by many, many levels. And that can be a difficult situation for some. If you're like me, who when I first started playing piano, I jumped into like the hardest things imaginable that I could possibly get to, and like stuff that's like way beyond what I should be handling. It just took forever on them, and as a result, I had a really low output. I was able to do those pieces fine, but that's all I did. I did like 3 or 4 pieces a year max, and as a result, I just didn't experience much music. I didn't really develop very much instinct for fluid sight reading ability or fluid reading ability, and as a result, I couldn't sight read. But I could play. And so I got into music school because I could play. And I was the worst reader there. And it was a totally embarrassing situation. And so believe me, for a person like me to be making this video right now to talk about sight reading, this represents a major victory in my life. And so I'd like to share how that came about and also share a couple of resources that maybe will help you, especially if you're a beginner or intermediate level student. I have a couple of really good resources that are going to help you learn to sight read better. They're just simple books that you can buy off Amazon, but there's a way that you want to think about sight reading. There's a way you want to practice sight reading. It's really, really important. A couple of really simple things. But first, let me say that it's ridiculously important. As far as like learning piano repertoire, it's really, really important for you to be able to sight read really well. Because the sight reading, your fluent reading ability, is the doorway that information enters your brain, okay? So if you're like me and you had a really bad sight reading ability and you're working on really hard pieces, it is going to take you forever to learn your music. You basically have to memorize everything you do or else you can't play it. Like that's how I was. I had to memorize everything I did or else I couldn't play it. It was kind of embarrassing for me because when I went to music school, which I did do, I study music and everything, and I'm playing like Chopin etudes and things like that. It just took me forever, like seriously forever to learn them. I was scared to death that a teacher in a class I was in, like a theory class or whatever, would call on me to play an example in front of the class. Even if it's a simple example, I could not play in front of people. I wanted to be in private. I had to work out all my stuff. I know there are people that are like that. I know there's a lot of people that's like that. That's why I'm making this video, okay? So just understand that that's a possible situation for you to be in, but you should try to get out of that situation. And the way you get out of this situation is, first of all, recognize that your fluid reading ability, which I didn't know what that was at the time, that is not your ability to study music, okay? So to train your fluid reading ability, you need to practice a very large amount of really easy music. And the other thing you need to do, in my opinion, this is probably going to surprise you, but you really need to be able to count extremely well, and preferably count out loud. So I adopt this rule. Whenever I am sight reading, I count out loud. And usually when I'm sight reading, I'm trying to keep the tempo down so that I can parse the information. And so I'll usually subdivide. If I can, I'll subdivide. I'll count the pulses in between the main pulses, which will let me be comfortable going at a slower tempo. And what that does is it allows you to stare at your music and see the individual like beat containers. That's very important. If you're not really actively counting, you're not really thinking about it. You're just kind of looking at it and intuitively, right? But you're only going to be able to get that if you're not counting, you're not thinking about rhythm at all. You're only going to be able to be successful in that situation if the music is just like extremely easy, okay? So it's really important you practice a very large amount of music, which I didn't do when I first started. You got to practice a large amount of music. You got to do it really often. You need to count out loud when you do it, and you need to try not to repeat things. And you just need to make this a part of your life. And you need a good resource that will help you. I've heard of things like Piano Marvel. I don't really know a lot about these types of things, but I know there's like websites and applications out there that can help you with this. So, that's one thing. Maybe you should look into that. But I want to talk to you about a couple of resources and how I use this with my students. And also, as you know, I run a big membership program where you can study with me asynchronously. And I use this resource. I actually use all of these resources in there. So the first resource I'd like to talk to you about is this one. This is called Sight Reading Exercises for the Piano by Hannah Smith. This is applicable to a student who is a beginner or an intermediate, even a late intermediate student, especially if they're really deficient on sight reading. This is 534 progressive exercises, as in they get harder, although they don't get harder like a total slope. It's more of like a little mountain and then it drops, and then a little mountain that goes higher and then it drops, and a little mountain that goes higher, right? That's how this book is experienced. That's how it's meant to be experienced. It's actually really cool. It provides you a lot of fodder to work through, and you're not going to be tempted to study this stuff because it's almost mindless. It's just exercises, right? They're little one-line, 5-finger position exercises. They look like this, right? And you'll just want to play a couple of these a day, maybe, and work through this over the course of a year or two. And, within weeks, you'll see a huge difference. But you want to do it in a certain way. So the way I recommend you do this, well, first of all, let me just say that if you're thinking that the 5-finger exercises are not going to be challenging enough, I understand that. If you're an advanced pianist, that's totally true. But if you're not, even though this book starts at the absolute base level, by the time you are into the end of the book, they're basically doing exercises that are like the hardest things you can do in a 5-finger position, in like 6 flats or 7 flats or 7 sharps or whatever, all kinds of stuff. So, it does get hard even though it's in a 5-finger position. And you might say, well, isn't like shifting around and moving around and changing positions part of sight reading? And yes, that is true. But the point is to develop an instinct, okay? As in a thing that you do where you don't have to think about it, okay? So yes, you're not necessarily changing positions in this book, but you are identifying pitches, you're identifying intervals, you're identifying finger numbers, and you're getting a sense of harmony, and you're making that instinctual. And that's the important thing here, because when you have this skill developed, then whatever you decide that you want to go learn, you're going to be able to get through it a lot more quickly. You're going to be able to parse a particular line or a phrase a lot more quickly. And then you will be a lot more successful, okay? So here's how you work a resource like this, okay? Here's what I generally tell my students to do. You find an exercise, say it's exercise number 17 or whatever, okay? You'll look at the exercise and you'll determine, are the hands doing the same thing or are they not? If they're not, then you probably want to do some prep work separately for each hand without playing. Okay, so here's what I tell my students to do. The first thing I tell them to do is to read the pitches. And if it's independent line, then I would say read the pitches for each line. If it is the same line, then probably read the line for the left hand, or if it's this, like if the notes are the same across both hands, then read the left hand because most people are not as strong on their left hand. Okay, read the pitches. You just put your finger on a note and you say the pitch, and then you put your finger on the next one. You say that pitch. Put your finger on the next one. Right. You develop this until you can identify any pitch in under a second. In a fraction of a second. It's really important. The next thing you can do is identify the intervals. Once again, you just take your finger and you put it on one of the notes, and then you point to the next note and you name the interval. Second, third, first, or not in first, obviously, unison, fifth, fourth, right? It's only going to be one of those because it is 5-finger position. And you don't even really need to name specific interval, just general interval is fine, especially when you're not a strong sight reader. If you're really not accustomed to sight reading at all, then you need to read intervallically, very instinctually, okay? Because we mostly read intervallically. And what that is, by the way, is that's basically like when you play a note and you play the next note and really just comparing the notes and you're not really thinking about what the pitches are, that's intervallic reading. And some of you might think, oh, isn't that cheating? Shouldn't I avoid that? No, that's actually one of the forms of reading. But pitch reading is another form of reading. So is rhythm reading, right? So is getting a sense of the harmony. There's all these different kinds of reading, these different forms of reading, and basically you want to train each of these up to be as good as possible. And then when you're in the moment, your brain will just selectively pick whatever skill is needed for that situation. For example, if you have a bunch of scalar notes, well, that'll be really easy for you to parse intervallically. But then if you have a really big jump, well, you're not even going to consider what the interval is. You're going to instantly go to pitch. If you have an interval that's like larger than a fifth or something, then you're probably going to think about what the pitch is. Sometimes you might read from finger numbers. Sometimes you might try to read thinking in scale degrees, right? There's all these different forms of reading, and you want to train those up, right? So we've covered two. You should read pitches. You should read intervals. Finger numbers can be helpful, and you want to maybe say that. I do have students say their finger numbers for their right hand, say their finger numbers for their left hand, and then finally you just play and count it. You play and count it. So you do the prep work, you do these 3 steps, and then you do the 4th step of playing and counting your piece or your little exercise. And if it's like really hard, you can play on right hand, play on your left hand, then play on both hands. But preferably, it's better to not do that. It's better to do it on both hands. And it's better to count out loud and subdivide, slow the tempo down to the point where you can play and you can see what the next idea is, what the next notes are before you arrive there. You got to pick a tempo where that's going to be true. Okay, you cannot force yourself to play above your means. You're just going to be making mistakes left and right. It'll be meaningless. So it's really important you play this really easy music really, really slowly. And what will happen if you do this is you're going to build your instinct up. Hopefully, you'll get better faster than the book gets harder. And if that's true, then what will happen is you will not need to go as slow. You'll be able to parse the information because you'll start to recognize patterns. You'll start to recognize things that you seem to be familiar with, even though you've never seen the thing before. And this is part of the process of running through 534 little 5-finger exercises. Is you're going to get a lot of exposure to practice that way, okay? And then you can run your repertoire separately. You don't have to worry about sight reading on your repertoire because you're studying a dedicated resource, okay? So that's what I would do for those of you who are beginners and intermediate pianists, and those of you who are interested in the asynchronous study program that I offer. I use that resource. I break it up over several levels of repertoire, and I tell you exactly which numbers of exercises to play in this book, as well as many other resources. Anyway, there's one other resource I wanted to talk to you about, and this is actually the main resource I like to use for repertoire for people that are below the advanced level. This is the Masterwork Classics. Now, you're probably thinking, well, why is he recommending a repertoire book for sight reading? The reason is, this is especially true if you are above the ability of this book, okay? So usually students finish this book by the time they're like early intermediate. For me, I start them pretty much right away when they first start. The second they know how to play notes and count, I start them in this book. And then they usually finish it when they're like early intermediate to intermediate, okay? And remember how I said that your fluid reading ability lags behind your sight reading ability? Well, these books, these Masterwork Classics books, are like a fair bit of repertoire, so not 5-finger stuff, like actual repertoire, in a very narrow level range. And so I'm sure there's other comparable books out there, but you want to find a book that has a bunch of pieces at a particular level, okay? So like, for example, you might be a late intermediate student, and you might think, oh, well, maybe I could practice something like the Burgmüller Opus 100 or the First Lessons at Bach or something like that. Wouldn't recommend it because those pieces are not all at the same level. Some of them are really easy. Some of them are like pretty hard, or some of them are a lot harder than the easy ones. It's not very flat. This is a lot flatter. So something like this. So if you're like playing out of the Masterwork Classics book level 4, level 5, then you should be able to sight read and count while you play things in this book, okay? And so if you're playing like more advanced things, then maybe you wanted to get the level 3 book, or maybe you want to get the level 4 book. It goes all the way to 10, so it is applicable even to advanced pianists. You can get these books that have this very narrow range of repertoire for you to practice reading with. And of course, you can get things like First Lessons at Bach and Burgmüller. Just understand that it's going to be really difficult to just read straight through those unless you outlevel absolutely everything. And in that case, I think the utility is a little limited. So that's how I handle sight reading. You got to count. You got to do a little bit of prep work to actually like train the different forms of reading. You got to be able to read intervallically. You got to be able to identify pitches extremely fast. You got to be able to think in finger numbers, think in scale degrees, and start spotting patterns in your music. You need to practice using a very large amount of really, really easy music, and you need to get comfortable slowing the tempo way down. And the fruit of all of this is that you're going to develop an instinct as in something that happens without your conscious thought. And you will identify at some point as a sight reader. And this is what happened to me. Now, I will admit I did not learn this way because, I was playing at an advanced level before I had to sight read. What ended up happening is I ended up taking some accompanying work, and I eventually an accompanying position and an organist position, and the amount of music that got thrown at me was just insane, and I had but it was like below my maximum level. Yeah, I had no choice but to become a good reader just because of volume. And I remember very specifically, I asked multiple professors when I was going into music school, how do you learn to sight read? How'd you learn to sight read? Almost all of them told me, get a church job, because it'll put you in the fire and you'll have to do it. And there's no other way. Well, that did work for me, but not everybody has access to that. And now I have a whole studio. I've been teaching people for many years, several years worth of pianists going through my program, and they all learn to sight read, and none of them have to have the pressure of a church position to do it, right? We just need to know, we didn't need to discriminate between fluid reading and our actual study reading, and we need to practice on a lot of easy music. We need to count and develop those skills, and it's just a matter of exposure and discipline. Anyway, hope that is a helpful video for you. I have a suspicion that at least for some of you that is going to be a helpful video, and if you like videos like this, I would encourage you to subscribe to my channel. And if you're interested in my whole asynchronous classical training program, especially those of you who are beginner and intermediate students, definitely check that out at flexlessons.com. Anyway, I'll see you in the next video.